Okay, so good afternoon, no, good morning to Yen, and then good afternoon to the rest of us. I'm assuming the rest of us are still in Asia. And today I'm Constance Chua from Tohoku University, and today we have Jedrzej Majewski from Adam Mickiewicz University. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. And he will be presenting some of the work that he did when he was a research fellow with the Observatory of Singapore. And in his, if I'm not wrong, 11 years in Singapore, he managed to uncover paleo-tsunamis from two case studies. One was the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and one is the 2018 Palu tsunami. So today he'll be showing the work that he has done from both tsunamis and sharing some of the lessons that he have learned. Yin, you may have the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's nice that you said all that because I was going to go through all that. So yes, I'll show you two case studies and also a little bit of information about my ongoing work, because I'm still working on tsunamis, just in a slightly different place. Now, most of the work I'll be presenting was done when I was in the Earth Observatory of Singapore, which is part of the Nanyang Technological University. And all of it was done in collaboration with various people from University Shaikwala and TDMRC. And the other two symbols here on my first slide is the National Science Center in Poland, which just funded my fellowship here in Poland now, which I'll get to later. So let me just find which button goes to the next slide. There we go. So I'm assuming that most of the audience has some tsunami research interest, but just for those who may not be so familiar, the most common scenario for a tsunami is this situation we see here. So in places with subduction zones like Indonesia, the west coast of Sumatra, or the southern coast of Java, or the east coast of Japan, the oceanic plate is sliding under the continental plate. And that means that here where they meet, between the earthquakes, the toe of that continental plate is sort of pulled in. And during an earthquake, it suddenly springs back. This is what happens here. And because water is incompressible, that water that's suddenly pushed out of the way, it has to go somewhere. So that's what causes the tsunami wave to start. And it's quite small in the open ocean, but as it gets towards land, it piles up and starts getting bigger and bigger. So that's the basic premise. There are other mechanisms which cause tsunamis, like meteorites or landslides, which we'll get into a little bit later, but this is by far the most common one. Now, what I do is paleo tsunami records, and that means I basically go and look at different places and find out what tsunamis happened there in the past. So why do we need to look at the tsunamis which have already happened? And obviously we can't help anyone who experienced those. The basic premise is that while we cannot forecast earthquakes or tsunamis caused by them, what we can do is look at the record and find out how often they tend to occur on a certain coastline. So for example, in 2004 in Aceh, we had a tsunami that very few people were prepared for. And it turns out that the previous time that a tsunami happened on that coastline was 500 years earlier, so they're not very common. Whereas in Palu, they tend to happen much more frequently, which I'll explain more about later. But basically, we're trying to reconstruct the extent, how high the tsunamis were in some cases, and how often they happen, so that in the future we can prepare the coastline, and knowing when we could be expecting another tsunami, how big it might be, and how often they happen, we can take different approaches to preparing for it. So the first case study I will explain is from a site called Suso. It's on the west coast of Sumatra. And let me go to a map here. So in 2004, after the tsunami, there was a lot of interest that people around the world, the scientific community, had in tsunamis. All of a sudden, this was something that became big. And there's really a big increase in how many tsunami studies happen after that point. But in Indonesia, a lot of the attention was focused on this small piece of the northern end of Sumatra, so the Aceh province. And you can see here the red line is the coastline which experienced the tsunami in 2004. Further south, the tsunami didn't cause much damage. And there's many sites which were explored during that time and published. So here's the sites, some of the published sites in Indonesia, and there's also some from Thailand and Malaysia. And of course, other places around the Indian Ocean as well. But this coastal cave here is the work which I was involved with from the Earth Observatory of Singapore. And it's one of the nicest sections you can see in tsunami studies anywhere. And so what this is you can see at the top you have nice light-colored sand from the 2004 tsunami. And below this, you have multiple light layers interspaced with these black lines. So the white deposits are mostly from different tsunamis. And the black deposits are cave guano, because this is in a cave and there's bats living there. So this is essentially bats giving us little time stops to see where the different tsunamis occur. Now, on this one image, there's about 7,500 years of tsunami history for that area. So there's about 10 tsunamis that were recorded in that image. And here, between the 2004 tsunami and the previous one before that, there was actually quite a long gap of about 3,000 years, which is basically a gap in our record. So the cave has now filled up to a point where each new tsunami takes away the top of the old tsunami record and replaces it with its own. So 2004 is lying directly on tsunamis which are much older. So we have this really good record in this cave. And so for the north of Aceh, we do know that roughly every 500 years there is a tsunami there. Although the last time when it happened in the 16th century, there was 2 tsunamis shortly, one after another, 50 years apart. Now, what we wanted to know in this particular study was actually what happens further south, because the coastline of Sumatra is long and is subject to a similar earthquake hazard. So what we wanted to know was whether there are other tsunami records further south than this. So we went to this site called Suso, which is just a few maybe 50 kilometers further south than the known extent of the 2004 tsunami. Now, the way we look for tsunami sites is we look at different types of geomorphology that helps to preserve the tsunami sediments. So one type is beach ridges, or rather the swales in between beach ridges. You can see here this darker patch. The beach ridges are usually built up of sand, whereas organic sediments tend to get trapped in between them. And every now and then when a tsunami happens, it'll emplace a layer of sand inside the swale as well. So it'll create a very distinct contrast that we can see. Similar processes occur in coastal wetlands, which actually in Sumatra is our most typical type of site. So these are areas where today mostly people are farming rice. These are sort of low-lying, slow water sediments. And one more site which is sometimes useful is Oxbow Lakes in meandering rivers. So you can see here that the river is here today, and you can see these. You can see that in the past there used to be a river running through here, and when the river disconnects from these old channels, they tend to get filled up with sediments very rapidly. So for maybe tens of years or a few hundred years, they are recording what happens in the area. So those are the types of sites where we look for tsunami sediments. Now, this is how we do it. So we tend to use a hand auger. This is the Indonesian collaborators from the Sheikh Kuala University who are showing how to auger right now. And as you can see in the background, this is a rice field right now. So we have this coring set. It can go down to about 12 meters, although in very hard sediments, as we tend to find on the coastline of Sumatra, usually we don't go beyond 8 meters deep. And in Suso, this is the site I'll be talking about a little bit more. As you can see, we sampled up to about 1.5 kilometers inland. These are all the sampling points showing us the stratigraphy. And this is what we're looking for. So here on the left side is the top of the core, and on the right side is the lower part of the core. And what we can see here in this image is a very sharp contrast between this coarse sand here and very highly organic peat. This is it's a little bit dirty from the sand. This is a field picture. So it's a little bit dirty on the surface, but this is almost 100% organic peat. So this type of contrast tells us that there was one type of coastline, probably a coastline freshwater forest or something like that. And then it was very suddenly covered with all this marine sand, which we are interpreting as tsunami, and I'll explain to you why we think that. So this is one of the cores we have from this area. Now, this is how deep it goes. So here you have centimeters from 0 to 450. So that's 4.5 meters deep. The bottom part of this is mainly sand. This is while this area was still a coastal lagoon. And then it was gradually being filled up. And at some point it developed a freshwater forest here. And then that was interrupted by a layer of sand. And then it returned to some finer sediments, which were interrupted again several times with more coarse sandy layers. So there's several things we looked in on here. First of all, we analyzed the grain size for this site. And so what the grain size tells us is that in this orange layers, we mainly have fine sediments like clay and silt. Those are usually deposited in slow-flowing, quiet water. So maybe inside the lagoon or something like that. And these are interspersed with these patches of, or these layers of coarser sands. So you can see the content of sand increases and the content of the other smaller fractions decreases where we see one of these. The second thing we looked at is foraminifera, because when we find a layer of sand, we don't know what caused it. It can be a tsunami, but in some areas it could also be a storm, or it may be the result of river flooding. Now, foraminifera are quite interesting because they're a small organism which only live in marine, in salt water, basically. And so if this was a river flooding, we wouldn't find any foraminifera in it. So the fact that we have foraminifera from these three layers suggests that the sand is actually of marine origin. Unfortunately, for this top layer, we didn't preserve the sample in the field. And then we also looked at pollen from mainly from this peat layer, but also from some other sites. And so what the pollen told us is that there was quite a lot of freshwater plants growing around this area at the time. It was also quite near to some coastal mangroves, but generally it tells us it was a sort of a freshwater wetland close to the seashore. And finally, we looked at dates. And unfortunately here we have a slightly one-sided view. So most of the dates came back to a very narrow range. Most of the dates came back to a very narrow range. So it didn't give us good dates for these upper layers. But what it did tell us is that prior to this first tsunami, all the dates were around 1,700 years before present. So this tells us something important for this coastline. What it tells us is that between 1,700 years ago and today, there was 4 events which all look to be most likely tsunamis in this area. So that means a tsunami interval of about 400 years, so quite similar to what we found from Aceh. But interestingly, we didn't find the 2004 tsunami here because it didn't reach this far. And so it's not necessarily going to be the same record. So this is not necessarily recording the same tsunami history as the other sites further north. So these could be different tsunamis. And so this project to us was important because it was a first step in some work that's ongoing. And what it demonstrated was that there is paleo-tsunami preservation further south than the 2004 tsunami. So we know other parts of Sumatra also have tsunami records. This is not entirely unexpected, but it really needed confirmation with evidence rather than just our expectation from before based on the tectonics of the area. And it was also quite successful in identifying 4 probable tsunami layers. So we didn't just get one layer that may be a little bit of something, but we got actually some repetition. So we are confident that this is actually recording some of these events that are occurring, and it's not just recording one and maybe missing quite a lot. So that was the first case study. Now I'll go on to the second one. The second one is a study that was already published. This is from the 2018 Palu Donggala tsunami. This QR code will take you to the publication if you're interested. It's open access, so anyone can read about the results. There's a lot more detail in there than I will be presenting here. Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. And most of the same organizations were involved in this study as the previous one. And a long list of people. So as I told you, I look primarily at old tsunamis. And so the question might be asked, why did we want to look at Palu Donggala tsunami, which only happened in 2018? And actually, we were there 1 month after the tsunami. So it's not what you would normally consider a paleo tsunami. But this was a very interesting event for many reasons. One of the major reasons is that it didn't occur on a subduction zone. Palu is not near to a subduction zone. It is near to this Palu-Koro fault, which is a transform fault. And so what happens is that the land moves sort of in this direction on one side and towards the north on the other side. This is not normally expected to cause a tsunami on its own. And as we've argued here, and as many other studies have argued, the tsunami was not caused by the earthquake itself so much as by a combination of some land shift from the earthquake and landslides, probably marine underwater landslides caused by the earthquake. So the tsunami shook the area and allowed soil on the slopes of this very deep bay to shift, and that's what pushed the water out and caused the tsunami. We sampled 3 sites in this area. One is in the north near Pantaloan Seaport, and this is a short map of this area. There's a boulder field which was quite useful to us. In the middle, these boulders were thrown in from the sea. And also we looked at some site further south in the city, in the front of the city itself. We have 2 transects here, and they're named after sort of the nearest buildings that we had near them. So this is how we decided to sample it. It's very similar to what you saw in Suso. So we start from the sea coast, and then we go inland to sampling at regular, well, not quite at such regular intervals, because this was in the city. So we had to actually find good sites for sampling. It's the preservation is a little bit tricky, especially since we came in after the cleanup had already begun, and a lot of the tsunami sand, but also the debris and other stuff from the waterfront was cleaned up. One thing that I'll point out here is that this yellow line here is at about 250 to 300 meters from the coastline. So the extent of the tsunami inland is much smaller than the tsunami, the paleo tsunamis that we found in the previous study. Now, the tsunami sediments on our sites were quite easy to distinguish. This is near Pantaloan. You can see the pre-tsunami soil is a nice dark sort of chocolatey brown. And then you have this gray tsunami deposit on top of it. So the sampling was quite easy. Similarly here, I don't know if you can tell, just where my pointer is, there's some buried grass. So that also gave us an indication in the city where the previous land surface was. Now, because this is a very fresh tsunami, the sampling was much easier than when we look at paleo tsunamis in Sumatra, because we could just dig straight down and take samples with a spatula. We didn't need to use coring equipment. And this is the major figure of that paper. And it presents all the sedimentological results, all the grain size results that we got from there. There's a few different things here. In the top panel, you can see the land shape. So you can see that the sites in the city were mostly flat, while Pantaloan was a slightly more raised site, where we can see the coastline getting higher inland. The blue line is an estimation of the tsunami height as explained to us by eyewitnesses and also from marks on buildings and so on. So it's a little bit rough, but there's other evidence we have to support that. In terms of sediments, we can see that they tend to be thickest near the coastline. In all 3 cases, the sediments are thickest near the coastline, and they're getting thinner as you go landwards. Now, in the city, it's interesting that the first 50 to 70 meters are actually barren of sediments. We think this is not just a result of the cleanup, but this is actually because the tsunami at that point was so powerful that it wasn't depositing sand. It was eroding the coastline, and it didn't leave a deposit behind. Whereas a little bit further in, you have flat landscapes, which once the tsunami got in, it started ponding, and it left behind more of a sediment that we can look at. In terms of mean grain size, we compared the tsunami, which is the yellow points, to the pre-tsunami soils. And closer to 0 means that the sediment is coarser, bigger. And so in all 3 cases, the tsunami sediment tends to be coarser, tends to be bigger than the pre-tsunami soil. In one case, it's a little bit mixed because this is an area which had some swamps in it, and It may not be the initial tsunami wave that leaves a lot of the sediment, but it probably settled out over the next few days as well. And so by that time, it was kind of slow moving, steady water. So it dropped a lot of the clay particles as well. So it's a little bit more of a mixed picture. The clearest picture is on this Pantaloan coastline, where you can see a very coarse sandy tsunami near the coastline, and it gets finer as it gets inland and loses the power to transport the sediments. In terms of sorting, there isn't really much difference. So the tsunami sediments are tend to be mixed in with the soils. We think this is because they have some of the same original composition. So the tsunami is sourced from the coastal soils which washed into the sea in the past. And finally, in terms of skew, the tsunami tends to be more skewed towards coarse sediments. So there's a lot more of the coarse sediments in them than there is of the finer sediments, whereas the soil on the coast tends to be the opposite of that. So the soil on the coastline tends to be from a slower depositional environment. Now, once we had all these basic measurements, we used a model which sort of which looks at the grain size on the coastline, looks at all this information in quite a lot of detail, and then calculates the flow speed and the flow depth that would allow the tsunami to deposit this kind of sediment. And so what you can see here is that, sorry, I just have to move this line out of the way. So what you can see here is the two transects in the city, and the flow speed is between 2 to 4 meters per second. So it's quite fast, certainly faster than you'd be able to stand in the tsunami. And the flow depth is between maybe 1 meter and 6 meters. But remember that this is the possible range that the model produces, and it's not necessarily representative of the exact measurement in that spot. So for example, here we have a range from 1 meter to about 7 meters, and observations from that area showed that it was about 5 to 6 meters. So it was in the upper range of this possible range. So we can see in these cases, the land was flat, and so we have very similar models. And it's important to note this distance, which I talked about before. The tsunami only washed in 270 to 300 meters. So we can see that it was quite big and powerful at the coastline, but it didn't wash in very far. It loses energy quite quickly. And for example, on this school transect, we visited a house which was about 200 meters from the coastline. And in that area, the villagers told us that the tsunami washed into the house and left mud all over it, but essentially was not life-threatening. It flooded, but it didn't. It wasn't a risk to anyone. Now, if we go to Pantaloan, the situation is a little bit different. This is actually me sitting on one of the biggest boulders that we see. Now, if this boulder looks a little bit too regular to be called a boulder, that's because these boulders were actually sourced from the seawall that was there before the tsunami. There was a low, about 1 meter high seawall. It didn't really do its job in this case. It got smashed and moved inland up to more than 100 meters in some of the pieces. So we can see that the power of the tsunami was quite big here. And these boulders are quite fortunate for us, because what we can do is use them as a sort of a second control on the flow speed and flow depth. Because in this case, we have the model predicting what the sediments tell us, but by the time the tsunami was depositing the finer sediments, it must have weakened already. So this is a sort of like at some point it was this. But the boulders tell us that at some point the tsunami had to be much more powerful. So probably the initial tsunami wave that washed in was much more powerful. At that time, it probably wasn't depositing these finer sediments yet, but it was powerful enough to bring all these boulders up to around 130 meters inland. The boulder I was sitting on is actually quite a long way, and I believe it's just over 100 meters inland. So that's a lot of power to bring it in. And so we can see here that the boulders tell us that the flow speed was actually closer to 6 meters per second at the height of the tsunami. And the flow depths, there isn't much difference here. So I think the boulders and the sediments agree in terms of what the flow depth was. So they're still saying 5-6 meters at the coastline. And here in Palu, we have a slightly better record because it's only the first 25 meters or so that were completely stripped. After that, we do have tsunami sediments. Now, whenever we look at this tsunami, we were thinking, well, is it going to happen again? Has it happened in the past? And so we wanted to check on this. As you can see in the past, this is actually where Palu City is now. It used to be most of the waterfront would be taken up by buffalo grazing. And in this case, in this photo from the 1940s, this is rice paddies here. So if this is kind of the type of area that we were looking for in Sumatra. So it's like a nice wetland with very slow flowing water. And so typically deposits clay or silt sediments. And so what we wanted to do was to take some samples from this and see if there's a tsunami record in Palu. And there was one spot somewhere on the waterfront, I can't point it out to you here on this 1940s image, where we did core down a little bit further to about 50 centimeters. And indeed, we found a deposit which looks like a sandy layer from a previous tsunami. And so this got us thinking, what historical records are there for this area? What can we find out about this area from the historical record? Now, this area wasn't colonized very early, and there isn't a lot of native records. What we do find is there is a legend in one of the Bugis manuscripts which tells about a similar event. It talks about an earthquake, and it could be a tsunami or a liquefaction event. We're not quite sure from the wording of it. This is pre-19th century. And then in 1879, there was a description for a tsunami in this area, but it wasn't. There was two descriptions. One was a description from the 19th century, specifically talking about Palu Bay. And then there was a very detailed description of a tsunami from 1879, but that one didn't mention the location. So we're not sure if this is the exact year, but there was a tsunami in Palu Bay with very large run-ups in parts of the area. And then in 1920, there was another earthquake and a tsunami, which was about 2 meters high at Dongola. Dongola is at the sort of the mouth of the bay, so maybe it was a little bit higher inland. I'm not sure. There is these records are really very sparse. They're not much more than a couple of sentences. In 1927, there was another earthquake, and they recorded subsidence at Talis. This is this area here in the picture, and that happened again in 2018. And in 1927, they estimated the waves at 15 meters. There could be some exaggeration there, we're not sure, but certainly it was a big event that they were recording. And then you have another earthquake in 1938. And in 1968, there was a tsunami, not in Palu Bay, but just outside further north. And so what we see here is that there was actually probably up 6 events that we're talking about in the previous 120, 150 years. So this area is very active. It has a lot of tsunamis, despite the fact that it's not on a subduction zone and it's not a place where we would normally expect to see a lot of tsunamis. And so what we took away from that was that in Palu, if you look at the tsunamis, they tend to happen quite often. They're very destructive at the coastline, but after the first 100 meters, they seem to lose power quite quickly. This is because not being caused by the subduction zone, there's a smaller volume of water that's actually moved, and so it doesn't have the power as in the 2004 tsunami to keep moving inland. And the fact that we have 6 tsunamis recorded before the 2018 tsunami means that there is a significant hazard here. And most likely, even these kids which are in the picture, they were near one of the liquefaction sites. I would expect that all of these kids will still be alive when the next tsunami happens. And so for that area, it's very important to look at this kind of information and to prepare the waterfront accordingly. So I would say the first 100 meters or so of the Palu city waterfront should not be residential buildings, shouldn't be densely populated, because we can expect another tsunami reasonably soon. Now, the last few slides, I don't have a lot more to go. These are just a little bit of a description of the stuff I'm working on now here in Poland. So this work continues on from where my Singapore work left off. So we went out and sampled most of the coastline of Sumatra with Professor Nazli and his team. All of these brown points have already been sampled. All of the blue points have been sampled and sort of initially analyzed already. And so my work here in Poland is funded for a couple of years to do the lab work on the sediments. So we're now processing the sediments here, and I'll show you some of the work that we're doing in order to analyze them. So the first tool we use is XRF. Now XRF scans through the sediments and tells us of the different minerals and chemicals in them. It's important for us that this is a non-destructive analysis, so we can look at the cores before we start sampling them. And it helps us to distinguish freshwater from marine sediments. And it also has a very high resolution, so we can look at very thin layers from maybe smaller tsunamis or events. The second stage is for us to subsample in some of the organic sediments in the cores, and that will be used for radiocarbon dates. Now, it's quite not entirely lucky. This was sort of one of the reasons why we chose to do the study here, is there is a radiocarbon laboratory at the same university where I'm working now. So hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit of better guidance from them about where to sample, how to sample, and which materials will work best as well. There is also a discount, and that always counts. And then we'll look a little bit at the grain size and foraminifera in the sediments. So in terms of grain size, as I was explaining, here's an example of a peaty sediment. That's sort of the organic growing in a wetland. This is a silty deposit. So maybe in a lagoon or somewhere like that where the water flow is quite slow, this is where you tend to get these fine sediments. And finally, at the top, you see this coarse marine sand. That's what we're looking for in terms of any coastal flooding. So these are the types of things we'll be trying to confirm with the grain size. And foraminifera are in this beautiful picture, which I'm afraid I stole from someone's publication online. I apologize to that person. I don't know. I don't remember where I got it from. But these are examples of foraminifera from marine sediments. And because they only live in marine sediments, you can only find them in floods of marine origin. You don't find them in freshwater flooding layers. And they can also help you distinguish tsunamis from storms or intertidal sediments, so the low depth sediments, because they have particular places where they live, and some of them only live in deep water. And so our sort of so our long-term goals for this project are to reconstruct the extent and timing of paleotsunamis on the Sumatran coastline. We're mainly working on the Sumatran coastline. And we hope that this work will help to prepare the coastline for this, mainly through education, sort of outreach activities, because these big tsunamis which happen on the Sumatran coastline, the best way to prepare for them is to plan evacuation and so on. And this needs to be done in many areas along this coastline. And somewhat important for this study is it's also the first time that a tsunami reconstruction will be conducted for most of this area. There's very little actual research. There are some studies, but there's very few studies. And we know that this is an area which should have a tsunami hazard. And that's all. Thank you. Yep. I'll stop sharing now.
All right. Thank you, Yen, for the wonderful presentation and for sharing your insights into the two tsunamis. Are there any questions for Yen? Hi, Robelin. Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, Jed. Would like just to ask, because I'm doing a similar work for my master's in Eastern Philippines. So my source is the Philippine Trench, or an Trans-Pacific tsunami. It's not yet finished, but I'm just curious about how you survey the historical tsunamis. Like, is there a standard questionnaire that you use for that? And if there is, if you have any other references, we do have locally here in our institute, but we can like share with each other the questionnaires that contribute to our analysis. Thank you.
So you're talking about witness interviews, yeah?
Yes.
So we actually don't conduct witness interviews very often because they, I mean, we do talk to people on site, obviously, but because if you're trying to publish the results of witness interviews, you're going to need to go through a little bit of an extended exercise of demonstrating that the research was done ethically, because it's human subject research. It's quite complicated when you do that in Singapore. But we tend to use the interviews more as a guiding tool to where we can find sediments from the tsunamis. Obviously, they will only be helpful in sort of the modern events, maybe historical events. Most of the people who lived on the coastline in Aceh or in Thailand, they didn't have any idea that there was a tsunami coming. For the most part, they didn't know what to do in the case of a tsunami at the time, because there isn't a community memory of that. The only place where there was on some of the outlying islands on this in front of Sumatra, where there was actually some cases where the communities had local sort of rhyming songs that they taught to little kids. And part of those songs was actually that if you see if the water withdraws from the coastline, you should run away to the hills. And so there's places there which actually evacuated really well because of something they didn't really remember, but they preserved it in the oral tradition. My short answer is I don't have a questionnaire that I could share with you. I think my colleagues at EOS, particularly maybe Susanna Jenkins, who does a lot of work after volcano eruptions. They've put a lot more work and effort into looking at which questions should be asked and how to ask them, because you have to be a little bit sensitive about how you approach people. You may find it helpful to talk with people who analyze storms, like Leia, who's sitting with her hand up there, because storms are much more frequent in the Philippines, and so they probably have this worked out to a better degree.
Thank you so much. Sorry, just last question. I think I missed it. What program or equation did you use for the fine sediment modeling?
For the fine sediments, I actually used Excel. Oh, sorry. Are you talking about the modeling?
Yeah, the modeling part.
Okay, then the modeling was done by Robert Weiss from Virginia
okay.
Tech.
So Flynn.
So if you want to work with him, you have what we used to do the modeling was output from a grain size machine. It needs to have all the sort of the raw output, so very fine size classes. So the data needs to be produced by some kind of grain size machine. In our case, it was the Mastersizer 3000, but Mastersizer 2000 or similar machines would also produce results that he can work with. You can find my email or contact Rob directly. I can help you contact him, and then you can see if you have sediments that you can work with. And for the boulders, it was actually also Rob's model, but a different model to look at that.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. We had a question from Leah, but
yeah, Leah was
I
asking a
don't...
question. Where is she? She's there. Yes. Hi, nice to see you again. Long time no see.
Nice. Yes, nice seeing you and nice hearing from you. Since you're working with paleo tsunamis, I would imagine that you would rely heavily on radiocarbon dating or any age dating method for that matter. So my question would be on the SUSO site, where you have
Really
age dates prior to the tsunami events. Is it? Yeah. So my question would be, what material did you use for the radiocarbon dating? And then the second question would be, is there a particular reason why you were not able to constrain the age for the, well, on the layers where the possible tsunami were seen?
Yes. So what we dated for SUSO were mainly organic fragments throughout the column, throughout the core. Unfortunately, when we got the dates, it turned out that most of them came from this one thick peat layer in the middle, and crabs and other creatures had basically transported them to different parts of the stratigraphy. They always do that. Now, when you're dating tsunamis, or for that matter, storms or something else, the problem is that the sandy layer is not usually that easy to date, right? So what we were dating here was, in fact, not the tsunami itself, but the organic sediments directly underneath the tsunami. So we don't necessarily know the year in which the tsunami happens. We know it happens after a particular year. There's a slightly different... but this is the closest we can get. Now, there isn't much material in the tsunami layers that we can date. And in the upper part of that section, the only organic material was that which was kind of transported out of that peat layer. So you could try dating shells and other things which do occur in the tsunami deposits, but then you don't know how long they've been knocking around. They could be, in some cases, knocking around for a couple thousand years before being entrenched in that particular tsunami. And so you'd be dating something much older than the event itself. So usually we try to date something directly underneath the layer. And if you have another organic layer on top of the tsunami, in this case, we didn't have a very good, the sediment above the tsunami, the first tsunami turned to a sort of intertidal silty sediment. It was very fine grained. There wasn't much organics preserved in it. So we didn't really have anything good to go with for that. But starting by looking underneath the sediments is the first step. And yes, C14 is the main way we are dating. You could use lead-210 in the upper part of the record. If you have shorter records, that maybe you're looking at the last couple hundred years instead. But for those deeper records, yes, C14 is the main thing we can use.
In your particular sites, aside from radiocarbon dating, then what are you exploring other dating methods? Like considering other.
So the project I have now is quite short. So I have funding for 2 years. So we're kind of going to be sticking to what we know doing it. So we're going to be doing a lot of geochemistry, forams, grain size, that sort of stuff. I have been in contact with someone who wants to do an extensive thermoluminescence study on the sands themselves.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that person was trying to get funds for that study and has not yet gotten the funds, and then they wanted to look at a lot of samples, and it's quite expensive. But yes, the thermoluminescence would be one way to do it. You would need bigger samples than what we got from those from that coring set, right? So I don't know. I guess you would have seen with Adam, if you've looked at the deeper sediments somewhere, where he bangs in like a PVC pipe into the sediment. That might be something I consider in the future, to get bigger samples of the sand so that I can actually get another way of dating them. That would be a very helpful way of sort of filling up, because you can't date sand with C14, whereas the thermoluminescences, you only date the sand. So they work well together.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
All right. Thank
Professor,
you, Yen.
I think
there's one
Professor
more.
Ip had his hand up at the beginning. I don't know.
Yeah, there's also one more question in the chat. Should we let Professor Ip go first then? Professor Ip, do you have a question?
No, I pass it,
Okay. Okay. So
express us the questions. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So we have one from Jim Bautista. Hi, can you shed a light on how do you use foramifera in distinguishing tsunami and storm deposits? Are there particular species that can be attributed to tsunami events?
Yes and no. I think I'm not a forum expert, so I'm just going to tell you what the forum experts tell me when I talk to them. But in general, there isn't one species that's just going to tell you, okay, this was a tsunami and this was a storm. But the composition, it can be slightly different, because the tsunami wave, when it comes through, it entrains sediments from much deeper down. So you can be talking about, sediments from 15, 16 and more meters down. So it reaches further down than a storm would. And so it will reach foraminifera that live in deeper environments than the storm. But it's a little bit tricky, because, tsunamis come in all sorts of sizes. And so if you have like a 2-meter tsunami or a 5-meter tsunami, it may not be distinguishable from a storm that is a 2 or 3 meter high event. Those foraminifera are in both places. And so you're going to see them in the record of both events. in Sumatra where we have bigger events, and the same could probably be said for some of the bigger events in Japan or some of the other big tsunamis over prehistory. The really big tsunamis should be distinguishable provided that the forums are preserved, but it's by no means easy. Another thing that is helpful to us in Sumatra is that we don't actually get storms in Sumatra. Sumatra is in sort of that perfect spot, that perfect range around the equator, where just the northern tip of Sumatra sometimes gets a weak storm. I only know of 2 on record that have just clipped it, and no part of Sumatra experiences storms on a regular basis. I know the Philippines is in a very different position where it experiences storms very regularly. So distinguishing a tsunami is quite difficult. There is another project at the university where I am at right now with Witek Struczyński. I'll type his name into chat so you can look it up if you need to. He's actually got a project called Sunastorm, and the purpose of that project is specifically to develop proxies which can distinguish between those 2 types of events, between storms and tsunamis. So if you want to know more about that, maybe email him, or you can even email him. His room is just down the corridor, so I talk to him quite a lot. He's also a collaborator on this project. So, but you usually use a combination. So forums can be helpful in some circumstances. The chemistry may be helpful because the storm is an event which takes time. It can be passing over a coastline for a full day or something, whereas a tsunami is much more constrained in time. It's only minutes to hours. So the way the sediments are filtered may be shorter and maybe slightly different. Yeah. So no easy answers. It's a problem that a lot of people have been trying to solve for the last 25 years or so, and still no golden bullet for that particular question.
All right. Thank you, Yin. Because the time is coming up to 5 p.m. Are there any more questions, or are we good here? Okay. So thank you, Yin, so much for being here today. I really appreciate you making an effort, 9 a.m. in the morning, just to do this. Really, really appreciative.
9 a.m. is not that early. People come to work by 7.
All right.
If anyone has any further questions that they would like to ask, maybe they didn't want to ask today in the presentation, I put my email in the chat, so feel free to email me any questions you have. I may or may not be able to answer them, but maybe I can help in some way or point you to a person that knows the answer.
All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yin.
Oh, sorry.
And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your attendance. And if we have the next speaker, please join us for the next presentation. Just inform anyone in the AOGS Coastal Working Group to get you on the list so that you could be informed of the next seminar. All right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.